All right, guys. Hello, hello. Hope you are all doing well this morning. We're trying something a little bit different here. We should have just met via Zoom, and so now you're probably going over the file that I sent you here, this little help session. Instead of forcing you to watch me try to do this in real time over Zoom and with all of the downsampling that's incurred through that, I'm going to try doing something a little bit different and actually make you guys a help video, a guide video that also incurs a little bit of an assignment and see how well that helps you guys follow a bit. We'll probably mix it up as we move forward, but I'm going to do this for today, this Thursday, and we'll see how this works, see how you guys fare here. So what I've done is I've removed everything from the existing Howie Honeymoon session except for the drums, and I've made a new session here called Howie Honeymoon Drums. I've already uploaded this to my Dropbox and sent you guys links, so you should have this downloaded to your computers. I know some of you guys are still fighting with getting Pro Tools installed, and hopefully we'll get that worked out as soon as possible so that you can start processing some of these assignments and working on your own at home and turning stuff back into me. So let's go ahead and take a look at this folder. This is the actual folder that contains all of the relevant materials of Howie Honeymoon Drums. It's a good idea to mention this just real quick. I'm not going to get bogged down in nitty gritty. We're going to actually get into different pieces of nitty gritty as we move forward, as that nitty gritty is relevant to whatever we're working on. Right now we're going to work on drum mixing, so I'm going to ignore a lot of stuff that would typically fit under the subheader of basics. So there may be some basics you don't know while you're doing some more advanced stuff, but I'm going to try a different approach since we're doing this all virtually instead of in class. But I do want to go ahead and give you some clues as to how this stuff works. Within the folder that I've sent to you, the Howie Honeymoon Drums, you're going to see a folder named Audio Files, an actual Pro Tools application file with the suffix .ptx, which means Pro Tools file, a backups file. So in case something goes wrong, you have a litany of backups you can access here. And this is your waveform cache or wave cache. And this actually is essentially like a table of contents for all the waveforms overviews you see within Pro Tools. It saves that in a separate file and it makes it a much more streamlined application. So I'm going to go ahead and either double click on this or right click and go to open. You can do either one. I'll double click this and it's going to pull up the Howie Honeymoon Drums. And notice everything is quite stripped down. All you have are the drum tracks and one master fader and all that fun stuff. And it should be the full song, but just drums, And if you've done some recording, you're going to look over here and notice that all of the volumes, which are here, and all the pan positions have been zeroed out. So there's no mixing happening whatsoever. If I start playing right here by clicking in the timeline and hitting my space bar or hitting play, you might notice that the drums are hideously out of balance because nothing is mixed, and that's what we're going to work on. We're going to work on some basic techniques of balance, and while working on the musical technique of mixing, we're going to learn some of the technical aspects that go into that musical process of mixing. The two things are very different, and I can't stress this enough. Anyone can learn to crank these knobs and move these faders around. That's no big deal. Being able to do it musically and doing it the right thing at the right time, that's the value. That's really the value, and that's what I want to. That's why I'm approaching this class a little bit differently, because I want to kind of focus more in on that value-added skill set and start with that, and then use the actual technical aspects as more of a back end, if that makes sense. That being said, let's go look at some organizational concepts, and we'll kind of start left to right. Right now, all the tracks are colored blue. I'm going to list some things that I want you to actually do and then submit to me for class on Tuesday, if at all possible, if you can get your Pro Tools working. So one of the things we're going to do is we're actually going to recolor all of our tracks as well as our regions. So we know that if we double click on the actual leftmost track color here, it pulls up my track color dialog. So I can click on yellow, and notice it changes that track header to yellow. Didn't change the regions, did it? If I click, drag, and highlight that full region, notice I should probably zoom out as opposed to scrolling through all of this. I'll show you guys how to do that shortly. If I do that and then double click on the header, colored header, notice it says tracks here or clips and tracks. If I go clips and tracks and choose yellow, they'll all turn yellow there, just like that. You can zoom in and zoom out horizontally and vertically with these toggle buttons within each window. Notice that. They're actually much like every application. There's 1,000 ways to do everything. You can actually do this up here as well. You can also do it with quick key commands. I use command brackets. Command brackets with my right hand quickly zooms me in and zooms me out just like that. Very handy when I'm trying to access all my data at once or quickly zoom in on something. We also have, when we get to our toolbar, you see we have a zoom tool here as well. So there's probably 5 to 10 ways of just zooming in on your session. I never use the zoom tool. I always use my quick key commands. But you may be a little bit different. The more you get experience with the program, that may change your particular approach. So what we want to do is go ahead and I'm going to color all of the tracks a different shade, a slightly off shade of blue, and all of the clips, regions, or sound bites, whatever terminology you like to use. And you remember we can select the track name and then shift click to select the bottom track name, double click, and I can choose a color I like. I'll choose one of these blues. I'll do a light blue. Look at that. Now we've changed all the tracks. Now what I'm going to do actually is use my command open brackets, zoom out, click, drag, hold, select all of my clips, double click, go to clips and tracks, and make them all that same blue. So now everything is kind of uniform. Bear in mind, there's not any real organizational reason to do this at this point in a drum mix because I have no other tracks to look at. I would typically do this to delineate my drums from, say, the guitars and the vocals so I can quickly get a visual overview of all of the different performing sections of this particular piece, if that makes sense. So let's also quickly go over what each one of these little horizontal slots, buttons, controls represents here. We can hover our mouse over the bottom line of a track and expand, click, hold, and drag down, and you'll see all of the controls of that given track. They minimize as we minimize the tracks. See that? So we'll pull it down so we can just take a look at one track. They're all still there. They're just minimized as the tracks are minimized. This first button is your track record enable. As long as your help windows are turned on and you hover a mouse over any given button, eventually a little dialog will pop up and tell you what that is, the solo. So this is the record enable track. If this is an audio track, which this is, it contains audio information. We'll get into some tracks more in just a bit. If I depress this, that means I have used the term is called armed the track. It is now ready to receive audio data from my interface, which should have a microphone plugged into it, which we're not working on right now at all. So there's no need to record enable anything just yet. This is the input monitor, which will then just let me hear what's coming into that track without recording it. This is, of course, my solo. This will mute all other tracks except for this track. This is the opposite. This will mute this track while letting all of these tracks play. This is my drop-down menu that shows me what I'm viewing in my given track. Right now, we're going to be working in our waveforms. We'll get to the other things you need to access in time, but for now, we're sticking strictly with the waveforms because we're working with audio files. There's a few other sub things down here that we're not getting into right now because these are kind of under the hood things. We're not doing any automation, we're not doing any timing issues, and we're not dealing with any Elastic Audio plugins at this point. We'll get to those when we need to. Inserts is where we will do exactly what it says. Insert plugins or DSP processing applications that run within Pro Tools. If you're a guitar player, you know how this works. This just is this exact same concept of plugging your guitar directly into a compressor and then out of the compressor and then direct into your guitar amp. If I put a compressor here, it would go kick into compressor, back out the sound. That's exactly how that works. Sends function just like a send and return does on a guitar amp as well. We'll get to this today just a bit. Because all this data you see here, this audio stuff, right now is going via my I/O section. Notice here it goes out 1 and 2, which corresponds to my interface or my headphones. Yours will probably say 1 and 2 as well, but that for the most part, for all of you, that'll correspond to either your interface or just the headphone port on your laptop. But this audio can be sent to other places via an internal busing scheme or an internal routing scheme, just like putting a diverter on a water hose and then taking that water and sending it to 5 other places in your house. You can do that with audio within Pro Tools. Once we get into our mix, you'll see exactly how we do that. And again, our I/O section, this is your input selector, output selector. We're not doing any recording, so I don't need to mess with my input right now. Output should be my interface because I want to hear the audio through my headphones. Beneath that, these are just little sub-menus. They're much more visible. If I hit Command equals, I can see my volume fader and my pan position much more clearly. But they exist here as well. So I can click on this, and you notice I get what's called a flying fader. If I click on the volume, I get like a little miniature fader that I can then turn the volume up and down for that track. Pan, I get the exact same thing. I get a flying horizontal fader, which allows me to pan the track to the left or to the right. Panning, of course, is just a gradient of volume as well. If I pan all the way to the left, or say 60 to the left, that means it's going to be louder about 60% to the left and 40% in the right, which creates the effect of localization, of placement. It makes it seem like it's somewhere else spatially, as opposed to just a trick of volume. Let's pull it back dead center just now. Just like that. There's a nice little trick in Pro Tools that if you've got things askew as such, but I want to pull them back up to unity or 0, I can hold Option and click it. Notice it pulls. If I do that, it pulls the pan right back dead center and the volume right back up to the top. So let's go back and listen to this just again. Step 1 is figuring out what doesn't sound right, and then making some subtle volume adjustments to try to get our drums a little bit more balanced. So I'm going to play this section here where there's a lot of stuff going on, and then listen and see what sounds bad. Okay, what I hear there, and in time you will hear as well, is that the cymbals and the hi-hat are all really, really, really quite hot. And hot is a term we use for just too loud. And that's just because cymbals and hi-hats are naturally loud. And we've got mic for the hi-hat, and we've got other mics for cymbals, so they're just really, 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 really hot in the mix. So we're going to temper those down. Before we start pushing faders, we might take a quick look at all the different tracks we have. Kick in, kick out, snare T for top, snare B for bottom, hat for hi-hat, tom 1, tom 2, tom 3, overhead hat, or think of that as overhead left, depending on how you pan your drums, overhead ride. I like how they don't name them left and right because that tells you exactly where they are in spatial relationship to the kit. And then room hat, obviously this corresponds to the where the hat is, the hi-hat is in relationship to the drummer. Right-handed drummer, that means if you're facing the kit, that the hi-hat is going to be on the right. If you're the drummer itself, then the hi-hat's going to be on the left. But we'll get to that in a second, why that's actually important. And then the room ride. So we've got 2 mics on the kick drum. One's inside the kick drum itself and one's outside. We've got a mic on top of the snare, one on bottom of the snare. This one's naturally going to be a bit darker. This one's going to be a bit brighter because it's up against the actual metal snares that are attached to the bottom of that drum. Mic right on top of the hi-hat. We've got single mics on all the toms. And we've got small diaphragm condenser mics as overheads. Pretty close, but still overheads. And then some distant mics right here. So we know that those cymbals are all quite hot. So what I can start with is grab that hi-hat, grab that, make a flying fader there, and pull that sucker down, like so. I might do the same thing with my overhead hat. I'm going to pull that down about 5 to 7 decibels. And I'll match that here. You can do this while playing the track, which I typically would. Actually, I'm just doing this now to kind of already that sounds 10 times clearer than it did when those cymbals were all cranked up. Much better. So this is what mixing is. You take all of your different tracks and you're going to place them localized in your left-right spectrum, and then balance them spatially and distance-wise with volumes or reverbs. That's a pretty nice little blend right there. Let's go ahead and mute our spaced out room mics and just see how our drum kit sounds with the kicks, snare, hat, toms, without any of the overheads and this kind of space mics. Yeah, it's pretty nice, isn't it? We pull the hi-hat all the way down. You know what? Ever there was a mic that was unnecessary, it's the hi-hat mic. Hi-hat always cuts through. You can push your, you get a sense of different timbre of your kick drums. That's the under snare mic. Yeah, so you can hear the different timbre in the snares. So now let's go ahead and hear just what those overheads sound like, getting a sense of what we have to play with. They're pretty cymbal heavy, aren't they? You're obviously not going to get as much close, close explosive tone from all the drums. Nice and crisp though, nice and crisp. See how our rooms convey. I can hear the distance there, can't you? Still a nice balanced kit. All right, so actually I'm okay with the balance there for now. Once we start panning things, we might change our balance around. At this point, we really need to talk about two different concepts. One is drummer perspective panning, and one is audience perspective panning. Once we start moving these little pan controls around, you are placing the listener either behind the drum kit or in the room listening to the drummer. So for the most part, we envision our drummers as right-handed drummers, which means our ride cymbal is to the right of the drummer, meaning the drummer sitting there as a drummer, he uses his right hand at the right cymbal. The hi-hat is to the left of where he's sitting, and the toms would move. Tom 1 would be the top left tom, Tom 2 would be his top right tom, and Tom 3 would be the floor tom, which is to his right. So were I to mix this drummer perspective, I would take the hi-hat and move it over to the left. I don't like hard pans. Hard pans really grab attention. Anything dead center or panned hard left and hard right grab too much attention. So I'll pan it off just a bit. Tom 1, I'll pull off to about 40. Tom 2, maybe off to the right 19. Tom 3, about 40 to the right. So what that does is it puts you in the cockpit of the drum set as opposed to being on the outside looking in. This is you mixing a drum kit as the drummer, called drummer perspective. We can even go through and I could have done this more easily. Solo these out and get a sense of how much space that gives us. That's already given us some space in the mix of the drums. You hear this tom fill, you hear the toms move across the panning positions. Yes. Again, that's drummer perspective, and that's how I typically mix drums. You don't have to. You can mix it audience perspective. You just need to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So now we know this is overhead hat. We know that needs to match the panning position of the hi-hat here. I'm going to undo solos. I want to take the overhead hat, and because these are set up as a stereo pair, these you do want to pan hard left and hard right because they're small diaphragm condensers. We can get into this later, but When they're set up as a stereo pair, they have built-in localization techniques based on mic placement, not on panning position. So for those techniques to work, you have to pan it hard left and hard right. Same thing with these. I'll have to pan this hard left and hard right. And now, listen to how much space is in that drum kit. Oh my gosh, that sounds so much better. Now we've got a lot of room sound, don't we? So that's a really, really big, you can hear that room. We were recording in Studio B at the Sound Emporium in Nashville, which is one of the best sounding rooms in the city. But we can minimize that by pulling our room mics down. Yeah, see, it's much, much drier. Let's go to the chorus. I can even pull the overheads down some more. You get a drier sound still. Now, if I move this back up, I get a whole lot more. Big old boomy room. Now, what I hear there is a lot of this snare mic, under snare mic, snare bottom. So let's try muting that, or just, well, actually what we'll do is we'll just pull the volume down, and then we're going to blend it into taste. Yeah, see, that bottom snare mic was really quite bright. I'll pull it a touch. Yeah, that's about what I want. Up here, yeah, see how snappy and bright that is? Now we're going to pull that back to about -10, -9. Yes, much better. And you might highlight a section of the tom fills and balance your toms to make sure that that top tom is as balanced as the bottom tom. And not too bad, not too bad. Yep, there we go, there we go. Now, that's a nice evenly balanced drum kit. And there's a lot of other little things we've got into no processing or nothing else like that. But there is one more thing I want to get into before I leave this with you guys to take and do your own, do everything I just did to your own little drum sessions here. And that's talking about auxiliary tracks and routing. And we're going to get into this really hardcore next week. But for now, I'm going to hold down my command key and deselect my tracks. What I'm going to do is create a new auxiliary track and make a master fader for all of my drums. And in doing this, you're going to learn the basics of internal busing and routing. So step one, we have to create a new track. Lots of ways to do that. Go to track and go to new, or hit Shift Command N. Once you do that, it pulls up your dialog box, new tracks. What do we want? We want one. We're going to need a stereo track. We'll talk more about what mono and stereo is here soon, but because all of these have panned outputs, then our input for auxiliary has to be stereo. We'll be getting into some mono auxiliary tracks next week when we start putting in our reverbs and processing like that. But for now, it's got to be a stereo auxiliary track. Track type, we obviously have audio tracks, auxes, masters, VCA masters, MIDI tracks, instrument tracks. This is an aux input. Then we click OK, create. And it's going to put that track right beneath the last highlighted track. And there it is, aux. I'm going to double click that name and name it drums. Now, you'll notice this has like a little line in it, no audio in it. In fact, I can't even grab this audio and put it in that track. So I'm going to undo that because this is an auxiliary track. It cannot house MIDI information. It cannot hold audio information. It is just a path. It is just a hallway. You don't, I mean, to use a really forced metaphor, you don't eat dinner in the hallway. You just go from living room to the kitchen or dining room. This is a hallway. We're just going to send audio through here. So notice it still has, it's stereo, so it by default has two pan sliders, and they're hard left and hard right, as opposed to being mono. It has a volume fader as well, and it has an I/O section as well as sends and inserts, not to mention solos, mutes, all the same things that a lot of these tracks have. What we're wanting to do is actually send or route each of these tracks out to this single track, so that when I pull this fader down, it turns down all of the drums, if that makes sense. So my goal is to be able to like have a nice internal mix of my drum kit. But if there's a section where I want to push the drums, I can just push my fader up a little bit, maybe 2 or 3 decibels, instead of individually turning up each drum. To do that, I need to access my I/O section and send the outputs of all of my drum tracks to the input of my drum auxiliary track. That requires you just keeping up with all of the I/O. Man, just keeping up with your I/O is the key to everything. Step 1, go to my input, drop-down fader, drop-down menu on my auxiliary track. And so I need to select one of my internal buses. Notice I have 128 available stereo buses, and they're paired up. Bus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll go ahead and grab a bus 1, 2. That's called a bus because buses take you places. So now my input of this track is set to bus 1 and 2. My output is set to actual physical output 1 and 2, which corresponds to my headphones, which you don't want to change that here. What I do want to do is change that on all of these tracks. I need these tracks to now go out bus 1 and 2 so that they can then internally, by magic, zoom out of virtual cable out of here and into here, and then out of here into your ears. So I can click on here, my output of my kick, go to bus, and select 1 and 2. Like so. Obviously, I can do all of these at one time. For instance, I can click, shift click, and then remember, as we discussed in class not long ago, hold down Option and Shift, click on my output, go to bus 1, 2, and they all change to bus 1 and 2. So now my drums should all be hitting my auxiliary track. So if I pull the fader down, it turns down all of my drums. I can also mute that track. If I solo, you'll hear nothing because if I solo this track, it automatically mutes these tracks. Likewise, if for instance I want to have some other things feeding into this auxiliary track, all I need to do is send their outputs to bus 1 and 2. That's how that works. Okay, I'm going to leave that with you guys right there. What I want you to do is to take your Howie Honeymoon drums and go through, color code everything, redesign your volume pan positions, and set up your master drum bus. And then I'm going to have you guys actually show those to me and screen share that with me on Tuesday, as long as everything works appropriately. If you guys have any questions over the weekend, give me a shout. Talk with you guys soon. Bye-bye.